Здравствуйте. Вы на канале, где мы не просто обсуждаем
Hello.
громкие
You're on a
события, а
channel where we
пытаемся
don't just
понять
talk
их суть
about big
в контексте
events. We
дипломатии,
try to understand
геополитики
their
и
essence through the
психологических игр
lens of
лидеров.
diplomacy,
На фоне самого
geopolitics, and the
масштабного за все время
psychological
войны
games of
удара
world
России
leaders.
по украинским
Following the
городам,
most massive
президент
Russian
США
strike on
Дональд Трамп
Ukrainian
сделал,
cities
возможно,
since the beginning of
самое
the
жесткое
war,
заявление
U.S.
в адрес
President
Владимира
Donald
Путина.
Trump made what
Он
might be
назвал
his harshest
президента
statement yet against
России
Vladimir Putin. He
абсолютно
called the Russian
сумасшедшим
president
и прямо
absolutely
обвинил его
crazy
в
and
бессмысленных
directly
убийствах мирных
accused
жителей.
him of senseless
Это
killings
заявление
of
уже называют
civilians.
поворотным.
This
И не
statement
только
is
потому,
already
что
being
ранее
called a
Трамп
turning
избегал
point,
столь прямой
not
критики
only
Путина.
because Trump
Дело в
had
том,
previously
что оно
avoided
прозвучало не в
criticizing
приватной
Putin so
беседе и не в
openly,
интервью,
but
а
also
как
because it wasn't
политическое
made in a
заявление
private
главы государства.
conversation or an
То
interview.
есть это
It was
сигнал.
a political
Мы с вами
declaration
попробуем
by the head of
разобраться,
state.
кому
In other
адресован этот
words,
сигнал,
it's a
чем он
signal,
может
and we're going
обернуться
to try
и
to
стоит ли
understand
воспринимать его
who
как
is this
изменение
signal addressed to,
внешнеполитического
what
курса США.
consequences might it bring,
Первое, что
and should it
бросается в
be
глаза,
seen as a
это
shift in
резкий
U.S. foreign
контраст с
policy?
прежней
The
риторикой
first thing that
Трампа.
stands out
За ним
is the
того
sharp
закрепилась
contrast with
репутация
Trump's earlier
человека,
rhetoric.
который
He had
ладит с
long been
Путиным.
known as
Он
the
не раз
guy who gets
напоминал
along with
о своих
Putin.
встречах с
He
российским
often
президентом,
reminded people of
подчеркивая,
his
что
meetings with the
именно
Russian
он, а
president,
не Байден,
stressing that
способен
he,
остановить войну
not
и их
Biden,
переговоры.
could stop the
Но
war through
теперь обвинение в
negotiations.
безумии
But
и ложного
now, we hear
миссионерства. Почему?
accusations of
Есть две
madness
гипотезы.
and threats of
Первая
new
– это
sanctions.
внутренняя игра.
Why? There
То
are
есть
two
Трамп
main
усиливает свою
theories.
позицию
The
внутри
first
США,
is
особенно
domestic
среди
politics.
колеблющихся избирателей.
Trump is
После
shoring up
возвращения в
his
Белый дом
position
ему
within the
приходится не только
U.S.,
удерживать влияние в
especially among
электорате, но и
undecided
доказывать, что
voters.
он не
Now that
трус
he's back in the
диктатор,
White
а лидер,
House, he needs
способный
not
на
only to keep his
жесткость
core
и
base,
моральную
but
ясность.
also to prove that
Последняя
he's
атака
not a
России дала
friend
ему
of
удобный повод
dictators,
для смены
but a
тона,
leader
без
capable of
необходимости
toughness
объяснять,
and moral
почему он
clarity.
раньше молчал.
Russia's recent
Вторая
attack gave him
гипотеза
a
– это
perfect
дипломатический
opportunity to
расчет.
change his
Трамп
tone
пытается
without
зафиксировать
having to
новую
explain his
позицию перед
previous
возможными
silence.
переговорами.
The second
Обвиняя Путина
theory
сейчас,
is
он как бы
diplomatic
снимает с себя
calculation.
будущую
Trump is
ответственность.
trying to
Мол, я
establish
назвал
a
его
new
сумасшедшим,
position
но все равно
ahead
пошел на
of
диалог
potential
ради мира.
negotiations.
Это
By
типичный для
accusing
Трампа прием.
Putin now,
Сначала
he
жесткость и
distances
публичное
himself from
унижение,
future
потом великое
responsibility.
соглашение,
I
где
called
он
him
выступает в роли
insane,
спасителя.
and yet I still
Так было с
sat down
Ким
for
Чен Ыном.
talks for the
Возможно,
sake of
так будет и с
peace.
Путиным.
This is
Но
a
есть и
classic
третье
Trump
измерение
tactic. Start
психологическое.
with public
Называя
aggression and
Путина абсолютно
humiliation, then
сумасшедшим,
follow
Трамп
it with a
использует не
great
просто
deal
ярлык.
where he
Он
plays the
намеренно
hero.
снижает статус
That's what
российского
happened with
лидера,
Kim
переводя
Jong-un,
его из
and
разряда
maybe that's what's about to
стратегических
happen with
оппонентов
Putin.
в
But
категорию
there's also a third
иррациональных
layer,
и
the
непредсказуемых
psychological
игроков.
dimension.
Это
Calling
типичный прием,
Putin absolutely
доминирующей риторики,
insane
свойственный
isn't
Трампу.
just a label.
Сначала унижение
Trump is
противника,
deliberately lowering the
демонстрация
Russian
интеллектуального
leader's
и морального
status,
превосходства, а
recasting him
затем
from a strategic
возможные
rival to an
великодушные
irrational,
предположения в
unpredictable
переговорах.
actor. This
Таким
is a
образом, он
hallmark of
выстраивает
Trump's
психологическую
dominant
рамку,
rhetoric.
в которой
First,
Путин окажется не
humiliate the
партнером,
opponent
а
and
проблемой.
demonstrate
Это дает
intellectual and
Трампу
moral
пространство для
superiority,
маневра.
then
Он
potentially
может как
offer
усилить
gracious
давление, так и
negotiations.
объявить себя
He's framing
единственным,
Putin
кто
not
способен
as a
усмирить
partner,
безумца и
but as a
остановить
problem.
войну.
That
Все
gives
это
Trump
вписывается в его стиль
maneuvering room.
политика, который
He can
сначала
either
создает
increase
конфликт,
pressure
потом
or
героически
present
предлагает его
himself
решить.
as the
Теперь
only one
посмотрим на
capable
международную
of
реакцию.
taming the
В
madman
Европе заявления
and ending
Трампа
the
вызвали
war. All of this
двойственные
fits
отношения.
Trump's
Страны
signature
Восточной
style.
Европы, Польша,
Create
страны
conflict,
Балтии,
then
Чехия
swoop in to
встретили слова
solve it
Трампа с
heroically.
одобрением.
Now let's
Им
look at the
важно, чтобы
international
США
reaction.
продолжали занимать
In
жесткую
Europe,
позицию по
Trump's
отношению к
remarks
Кремлю.
sparked
Но в
mixed
Париже и
feelings.
Берлине все не так
Eastern
однозначно.
European
Для
countries,
них главное –
Poland,
стабильность.
the
Они
Baltics,
боятся не столько
Czechia,
Путина,
welcomed
сколько
his statement.
хаоса.
They want the
Когда
U.S.
Трамп
to
делает
maintain a
резкие
tough
заявления без
stance on the
координации с
Kremlin.
союзниками,
But in
это
Paris and
вызывает у них
Berlin,
тревогу.
the response
Сегодня он
is more
назвал Путина
cautious.
безумцем, а
For
завтра
them,
вдруг предложит
stability
снять
is
санкции ради
paramount. They
грандиозной
fear
сделки.
chaos more
Аналитики
than they
Брюсселя
fear
не
Putin.
скрывают
And when
беспокойства.
Trump makes
Они не
provocative
уверены, что за
statements
словами
without
Трампа последуют
coordinating with
реальные шаги.
allies, it
Более того,
unsettles them.
некоторые считают, что
Today
он
he
действует
calls Putin
импульсивно,
insane,
что
Tomorrow, he might suggest lifting sanctions for the sake of a grand bargain. Analysts in Brussels are openly concerned. They're not sure Trump will follow words with real action. Some even believe he acts impulsively, driven by headlines rather than strategy. And while moral condemnation of Putin is welcome, the EU wants to see concrete policies behind the words: support for Ukraine, NATO coordination, diplomatic engagement. As for the Kremlin's response, it was muted. Dmitry Peskov called Trump's remarks an emotional overload. This is a standard formula used when Moscow wants to downplay a statement without burning bridges. Putin currently has no interest in losing Trump as a potential partner. And from the look of it, the Kremlin hopes this was just a public outburst. But will Putin really see it as just an emotional outburst? Unlikely. Russia monitors every shift in American rhetoric closely. The fact that Trump has spoken so harshly for the first time will certainly be seen in Moscow as a warning, especially if it's followed by real actions, new arms shipments to Ukraine, or sanctions against the Russian defense industry. Several scenarios are possible. 1. Ignore it and wait for the rhetoric to fade. This is a typical Russian diplomatic tactic. Act as if nothing serious happened and assign no importance even to the harshest statements. It's used when Moscow believes no real action will follow the words. In this case, the Kremlin may simply wait it out, assuming Trump's remarks were triggered by domestic factors like media pressure, Ukrainian lobbying, or electoral calculations. Russia will continue business as usual, displaying cold disregard. The message: call us what you want. We follow our own logic and don't care about emotional flare-ups. This approach also allows Moscow to resume dialogue later without losing face. If Trump softens his tone in a week or a month, the Kremlin can pick it up as a new phase, pretending the previous statements never happened. 2. Counterattack, but not directly against Trump. If harsh rhetoric from Washington continues, Moscow might go on the offensive, but without targeting Trump personally. Instead, pressure will increase on other players: Ukraine, the EU, and U.S. allies in Eastern Europe. The goal is to shift the focus and paint them as the true provocateurs. This would be supported by intensified propaganda, both within Russia and abroad, blaming the West for supporting a Nazi regime in Kiev, invoking double standards, and trying to divide public opinion in the U.S. and EU. It may also include demonstrative moves, military drills near NATO borders, withdrawal from international treaties, or economic pressure on dependent markets. But again, no personal attacks on Trump. Moscow still hopes he could play a special role, so they don't want to burn that bridge just yet. 3. Double game. Escalation plus covert diplomacy. This is the most likely scenario. The idea is to combine aggressive public action with quiet behind-the-scenes outreach. Moscow has used this strategy many times in Syria, during the Donbass conflict, and even amid energy crises. On the surface, Russia will continue large-scale strikes against Ukraine, applying pressure on both the battlefield and public morale. The message to Kyiv and the West: we won't retreat under pressure. There might even be new moves in other regions, the Arctic, the South Caucasus, Transnistria, to create a multi-crisis effect. Meanwhile, back channels with Washington could be quietly activated through business lobbies, former diplomats, intermediaries in Turkey, the UAE, or Israel. The message: we're open to talks, but only with those who speak the language of strength and deals. In other words, with Trump, the goal here isn't necessarily agreement, but to show we're still a key player. Without us, there's no war and no peace. If Trump wants to play peacemaker, Russia will be ready to benefit from both concessions and the optics of returning to negotiations. Which scenario plays out, we'll see in the coming month. But one thing is clear. For the first time in a long time, Trump no longer sees Putin as a negotiation partner, but as a threat. And that changes the game. Thanks for watching. Subscribe so you don't miss our next breakdown. Here, we don't repeat headlines. We read between the lines.
Здесь мы не повторяем заголовки. Мы читаем между строк. До свидания.